Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into everything to do with the Los Angeles Kings. I'm Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get started.
Looking at the offseason additions that the Kings made this year, they brought in, most importantly, Pierre-Luc Dubois, goaltenders Cam Talbot and Riddick, Trevor Lewis, and one of the most underrated players, along with future considerations, and that is 30% of Ivan Provorov's $6.75 million cap hit.
On the subtractions front, Gabe Vilardi, Alex Iafallo, and Rasmus Kupari went out for the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. You've also got Joonas Korpisalo signing in Ottawa, and depth defensemen Sean Jersey and Sean Walker leaving the team as well this offseason.
Moving on from the offseason moves to looking more in depth at some of the biggest arrivals. It's pretty obvious who the biggest add is for the Los Angeles Kings here, and it's Pierre-Luc Dubois. This is a player who's put up back-to-back seasons above 27 goals, 27 last year, 28 the season before. And in his career to this point, he's had 4 seasons above 20 goals. So this is a guy who is a pretty consistent goal scorer in the NHL. He's also a pretty dynamic power forward. He had over 100 hits last year, so really good guy to have on the forecheck. Big frame at 6'2", 205 pounds. So acquired in a sign and trade with the Winnipeg Jets. Was pretty heavily rumored to go to the Montreal Canadiens, but ends up in LA, and he signs an 8-year, $8.5 million contract, and this is already the third team in his young career.
Talbot's kind of been a journeyman in his career. He's played for teams such as Calgary, Edmonton, Minnesota, Ottawa, and now he finds himself on the LA Kings, where he signed a one-year, $1 million deal in the offseason. And he's a veteran netminder, will be solid in a tandem. You can see his stats there, an 898 save percentage with Ottawa, which isn't the best, but he was an all that was good enough for an all-star appearance last year, or 2 years ago, was it? But he's a veteran netminder that should be able to provide some solid starts for LA.
The third biggest arrival for the Los Angeles Kings is Trevor Lewis. This is a depth centerman who can play in any minutes, any situation with the team. He signs a one-year, $1 million deal, and he should be the glue that keeps the bottom six together for the LA Kings this season.
Moving on from the biggest arrivals to the future outlook for this team, the number one prospect, obviously with Quinton Byfield graduating the past couple of years, is Brandt Clarke there. Absolutely dynamic offensive defenseman who Nick will get into a bit more later on. You also have guys like Jordan Spence and Alex Turcotte for what is somewhat become a little bit of a depleted prospect pool with many graduations over the past couple of years. And Francisco Pinelli is a guy that I believe Nick likes a lot as well.
And looking at their draft capital there, the LA Kings went through a pretty accelerated rebuild. I know fans are expecting the long haul after those like Stanley Cups and the aging core, but they seem to be really trying to compete again. So they've started to spend some of their picks, but they still have a fair bit of draft capital here that they could look to move as well.
Onto the prospect spotlight for the Los Angeles Kings. The three prospects that we're going to highlight today are Brandt Clarke, Jordan Spence, and Alex Turcotte. The first prospect of note is Brandt Clarke, and this is the former 8th overall pick in the 2021 draft that LA probably was lucky to have at the time because this has turned into a huge steal at 8th overall from that draft class. Brandt Clarke is a dynamic, shifty, offensive-minded defenseman who put up immense numbers in the OHL last year. As you can see there, 23 goals in 31 games as a defenseman is pretty unreal. Sometimes you found this guy behind the opposing team's net in the offensive zone, despite him being a defenseman. This guy is super offensively gifted. It'll be questionable to see his defense presence in the future on the defense core of the Los Angeles Kings, but I think alongside any defensive defenseman, this guy can roam free where he wants to go, be sort of a rover, and lead the rush as well as be part of the rush anytime he wants to be. The second prospect of note is Jordan Spence. This is a agile and quick-footed AHL defenseman last year, drafted in the 4th round in 2019. Bit of a steal at 95 as well. Los Angeles is finding a good amount of defense prospects within the drafts. So this is a short 5'10", 180-pound defenseman who's a bit older now, but he has proven well And fun fact, he is also born in Australia, so he got a standing ovation in the Australia game against the Coyotes earlier. The third prospect of note is Alex Turcotte, and this is sort of a now a project at this point, being drafted so long ago in 2019. He has great hockey IQ. He is a decent skater as well as a good shooter. He's sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, in my opinion. I think he's one of those guys that will fall through the cracks a bit, as he doesn't have a sort of a special skill to cement himself in a lineup as a Quinton Byfield would with his size and speed, or Brandt Clarke with his offensive instincts. But still, Alex Turcotte can perform, can produce. He has played in the AHL for the past couple seasons now, and his production has pretty much plateaued around like half a point a game to 0.75 points per game. I still look for this guy to be an NHL in the future. I hope his confidence is still there, and I look to see him have a strong season this year to prove himself that this was not a fluke, and he was not just part of that group of U.S. guys that was so good in the 2019 draft, like Jack Hughes, Trevor Zegras, among others. He is still himself a good player.
Moving on from the prospect spotlight to take a look at the lineups coming into the season for the LA Kings. What is a really deep offensive group here, in my opinion, despite some subtractions in the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. So the first line there's Quinton Byfield, Jose Kopitar, and Adrian Kempe. So going to be interesting to see if Byfield can take a step this year and really cement himself as a top six forward in the NHL, as we'll get into a bit later on. But obviously the other 2/3 of that line are known commodities at this point in Kopitar and Kempe, two great players that have a good dynamic together. A really good second line as well with Kevin Fiala, Pierre-Luc Dubois, and Arthur Kaliev. Kaliev's a guy I look to take a big step this year and has been a goal scorer in every other level he's played up until the NHL at this point. So be interesting to see if he can take a step similar to Byfield. And Fiala is just electric, and we've already spoken about Pierre-Luc Dubois. And in my opinion, a really good third line as well, too, with Trevor Moore, Philip Deneau, and Victor Arvidsson. All three guys that I really like all bring a bit of a different dimension. Trevor Moore is a good forechecker, high energy guy. Philip Deneau is one of the best defensive centers in the NHL. And Arvidsson has some really high offensive upside, as he's shown in previous stops like Nashville and a couple previous seasons with the Kings. Solid fourth line as well with Carl Grundstrom, Blake Lizotte, and Trevor Lewis. No complaints there. Pretty good line. Pretty solid. Yeah.
Onto the projected defensive pairs for the Los Angeles Kings. We've got long-standing assistant captain Drew Doughty there on the right defense side. This is a guy that is still in that $11 million a year contract, and some people have questioned his production in recent years, but I believe he still has an extra gear to kick in. Despite being 33 years of age, he still has a few more years of legs to give, in my opinion, so I think he'll be a good spot, probably on the number one power play as well, but I would be encouraged to see if Brandt Clarke could contest for that spot later in the year, depending on how much ice time is given to Brandt Clarke. As you see there on the left side, you've got Mikey Anderson, who's a swift skating defenseman, to play alongside Drew Doughty and help him out defensively, as well as Vladislav Gavrikov, who they acquired from Columbus last year and has now cemented himself as a great top four defensive defenseman within the Los Angeles Kings system. You've got Andreas Englund and Matt Roy on the bottom pair there. That used to be sort of Sean Walker's spot on the bottom pair as that shelter defenseman, but now you see Matt Roy, who has played top 4 minutes before, take that third pair right defense spot, as Brandt Clarke is now thrusted into that top 4 spot. So I do expect this defense core to compete very well with top offenses, with Matt Roy, Gavrikov, and Anderson split between the lineup, as well as Drew Doughty and Brandt Clarke as offensive options.
And finally, looking at the goaltending here for the Kings, and this could be kind of viewed as a weakness of the Kings. It's relatively unproven. Phoenix Copley right now as the starter, he kind of came onto the scene out of nowhere last year. The Alaska native really came on and was valuable for the Kings later down the stretch, and until they got Korpisalo, really carried them into that playoff spot. Cam Talbot, as I talked to before, he can be a solid 1A, 1B tandem goalie. He's a bit veteran, and he has struggled with some consistencies, with his consistency later on in his career. So we'll see which version of Talbot they get night in, night out. And then finally, David Riddick has been a pretty solid backup throughout his career. So he's a nice depth piece there.
Moving on from the projected lineups to the storyline surrounding this team headed into the season. So the first one there, kind of a perfect segue from what Noel was just discussing, is the search for a true number one goaltender. So Phoenix Copley is a guy who played pretty admirably last year for the Los Angeles Kings after he was forced into that role when Cal Peterson and Jonathan Quick weren't what they expected them to be. So he put up a 903, I believe, last year, which is serviceable. It's nothing wrong with that. And then Cam Talbot was a sub 900, but that was on a pretty defensively lacking Ottawa Senators team to start out the year. So we'll have to see if he can rebound. I think that they have pretty good stopgap solutions there, but I definitely think this is a team that's going to continuously be in the rumor mill looking for a goalie. Uh, so the two names that really come to mind are the two major goalies in the rumor mill, and that's Connor Hellebuyck and John Gibson. Do you guys have any thoughts on maybe which one of those two you'd prefer, or what how you think you could see that unfolding for this team?
Between the two of them, I am more of a fan of Hellebuck than Gibson. He'd probably command a lot more money than Gibson if they were to sign him in free agency. And I compare the Kings to kind of like Pittsburgh and lesser extent Boston, but they have an aging core, or at least some star players that carried them to greatness before, and they're trying to do justice and win them another cup. So addressing goaltending, I think especially if it kind of blows up this season, and they may look to add at the deadline, it will be really important if the Kings want to win a Stanley Cup. So I think Hellebuck would be a great fit here for the Kings.
And I'm curious whether they have to do anything to still make the playoffs, but I think they do have to do something to win the Stanley Cup. That's the next step rather than just playing a round or two and falling out and kind of checking off another season as being just one and done. So I think that a goaltender like Hellebuyck could help this team tremendously. We saw what Korpisalo did last year, having very good numbers, opposite of what he had in Columbus, to come over here and help alongside a good decor. As long as the better team helps the better goalie, and vice versa, the teams and the goalies should both perform well. So I think Hellebuyck is the best case scenario for the Los Angeles Kings. This is a goaltender who can play upwards of 50, 55 games if they get him earlier on in the season. And if Winnipeg is looking to sell off that asset as well, that'll be interesting to see. I think John Gibson is quite the intriguing piece as well because of his value right now. I don't know what the Anaheim Ducks are valuing him at right now, but I could assume that his value should be at an all-time low based on his recent production, his statistics, anything underlying numbers as well. They're all quite bad at this point because of his many years with an Anaheim Ducks team that has not been great. So that might be an asset to buy low on and see if he can play alongside a great defense and a great offensive core and carry them to the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Noel, about the fact that this isn't a team with an aging core, but I think a team that I'd really like to compare them to is kind of like the Dallas Stars light, to be honest. This is a team that has an aging core, but also has a young up and coming
Mm.
core at the same time, and they're kind of assimilating them in together because you have guys like Byfield, Fiala, Brant Clark, who are all well, Fiala's already there, but all projected to be great young players coming up. And then you still have guys like Kopitar and Doughty. So I think the goal for them should be to find a goalie that can kind of transition them into their new phase. And a guy like Hellebuyck, I think he's 30 years old or something, so he definitely fits the bill. And Gibson's right around that same age. So I really think if you acquire one of those two goalies, you can't go wrong. Obviously, Hellebuyck's the superior goaltender, but that acquisition cost for him would be incredible. Like it'd be a lot they'd have to give up. They'd have to really dip into that depleted prospect pool and move out some picks. I like what you said, Nick, about John Gibson because they could pick him up cheap right now. So really, I don't think they could go wrong if they picked up one of those guys. But I think at the end of the day, they have to address this eventually.
You guys think they're going to trade for one of these goalies, or are they going to try and sign them in free agency?
I think they can't wait at this point. This is a year that they have to decide whether they're going to be competitive or not, and not waste another year of those guys like Anze Kopitar and Drew Doughty. Anze Kopitar has limited years left in his NHL career, unfortunately, at this point. He's had a tremendous career, being like one of the only Slovenian players to make it to such great heights in the NHL. But this is a guy who wants his team, and as the captain, I think they have to do him justice by helping him out this year and getting a goaltender that can carry them into the playoffs immediately, kind of.
Right. So then, if we're looking at a trade, I wonder. We've already seen them make a deal with Winnipeg, and they sent Winnipeg a lot of depth pieces. We'll talk a bit about that later, but they'd have to really empty out their farm system in order to acquire Hellebuyck. And is that really what Winnipeg would want? As we just saw, they wanted NHL players in the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. And then would Anaheim be willing to trade to a division rival, another LA, another Californian team? So just a little bit of food for thought there.
Yeah, I very interesting points to raise there. I definitely think regardless of who it is, it's going to depend on how the season plays out for a number of teams. Because obviously, LA has to be very successful if they decide they need to add at the deadline. So that's the first component, which I expect to happen. But if they're going to be going out and getting Hallebuck, then Winnipeg has to probably do poorly and
Yeah.
not be in a position to make the playoffs by the deadline. So that's something to think about there. And Gibson, I think he'll be on the market pretty much regardless. But again, it really depends on how LA's doing and I guess who the highest bidder will be there.
Yeah, and further to that, if Hellebuck's on the market available to the LA Kings, he's not just available to the LA Kings. He's available to all contending teams that want a bona fide starting goaltender. So the acquisition cost will be extremely high. The bidding war will get crazy, and I do think the Los Angeles Kings will lose out on that bidding war based on the amount of prospects and availability they have to give away. They're not ones to give away their top prospects. Like Brant Clark will not go back in the deal, for example.
Yeah. And as we said, I believe in the Winnipeg Jets video, like Hallebuck would be the best goalie traded since Roberto Luongo, in my opinion. Like this doesn't happen often where a absolutely franchise altering goaltender is on the market. Moving on to our next storyline, and it's going to be whether Quinton Byfield can take a next step. So, just to go over some of his recent history, he's played 99 games in the NHL so far, and he's put up 52 points across parts of 3 seasons. So, not exactly what you'd be expecting from the former number 2 overall pick, but in a more positive light, last year when he was sent down to the AHL, he had 15 points in 16 games. So that's pretty impressive for a 21-year-old. And he also looked good in last year's playoffs. On that first line, he put up 4 points in 6 games. So uh, maybe not progressing exactly as you would have hoped at this point. But how do you guys feel about Quinton Byfield's progression, sorry, and maybe a little bit of a future outlook for him?
Before I talk about Byfield, and this is no insult to him, but I just want to shout out Tim Stützle, the third overall pick in this draft. It just really says something about the Ottawa Senators scouting, and just they got really lucky that Stützle fell because, in my opinion, he's better than both Byfield and Lafreniere. But that doesn't mean that both Lafreniere and Byfield are bad players. I think Byfield's shown some great promise in his career. He's a big dude. He has a lot of tools that will make him a very good NHL player, and he just has to put them together. And I think he's already started to do that, given his opportunity on that first line with Kopitar and Kempe. And Kopitar is a great player to learn from too. An excellent leader, been a pro for a long time, been a good pro for a long time. So I think I'm not too worried about Byfield. I'm thinking you'll have somewhat of a breakout season this year.
Yeah, and keep in mind that he actually had 52 penalty minutes in 99 games. He actually only had 33 points in 99 games in his NHL career so far. So that's a very interesting little tidbit that he's only peaked really at 22 points in a season so far in his 3 year or 2.5 year NHL career. But that being said, the Los Angeles Kings have a very modern style of lineup construction. They like to put their centermen 1, 2, 3. They've got uh, Kopitar, and then Dubois, and then Deneau. Those are three super strong centermen to play alongside rookies. Like you see Arthur Kaliev up there in the top 6 already, which is something that very few teams will allow for. If you're a young guy, you have to sort of like earn your trust and earn the ability to play in an NHL top 6. But Los Angeles Kings have said, no matter what, we're going to develop you alongside some of the best players in the NHL, like Anze Kopitar. Byfield, you're going to get a chance to play with one of the best playmakers and best facilitators in the NHL, which is something that very few players have the opportunity to do. So I do think Quinton Byfield can play better this year as well as produce to prove that he's playing better this year. In junior, he kind of became a man against boys. Obviously, with the size, he's a guy that just sort of stuck out like a sore thumb on the ice, but he used that and he used that advantageously to sort of just body his way through everybody and put up 82 points in 45 games. In his draft year, basically. So he's a guy that now playing against like the men and the bigger bodies and everything like that has sort of taken a step back, being a little bit of a reality check at this point. But I do think if he asserts himself and plays like he did in junior with sort of just, gung ho, I'm going to try to score on you, I'm going to try to beat you up, I'm going to crash the net, in a sense, I think he could do well alongside guys like Kopitar.
My mistake on that point total there. Would you say it was 39? Sorry.
33 points in 99
33.
games,
So
unfortunately.
yeah, so not as even good as I thought there to begin with. So that's unfortunate. But at the end of the day, I think as we'll get into the next topic, but I think kind of subtractions in depth is kind of what's facilitated Kaliev and uh, Quinton Byfield moving up in the lineup this soon, because Iafallo and Velarde are now gone. So those are two top six forwards that are no longer with the team, and these guys are really going to have to step up and kind of fill in those positions around the now incredibly deep center depth that this team has. Uh, if you guys were to try to think of a point total for Byfield coming into this year, what do you guys think you'd put that around?
I'm gonna hover around maybe 15 goals, 40 points. On the top line, he's going to get lots of exposure. I don't think he'll be on the first power play, but he's going to get some good exposure out there.
Yeah. Barring any injury concerns, which he has not played very many full seasons
Mhm.
so far in his career, I do agree with Noel that around 40 to 45 points, if he stays on the top line, I do hope that LA keeps this strategy intact throughout the season to allow for these young guys to go through the growing pains alongside guys that have been there before and can help them out.
Yeah, I'm right in line with you guys. I was thinking if he puts up 50 points this year, I think that'll be an incredibly successful year and a great step in his development. That'll bring us into our final storyline surrounding the LA Kings this year. And that's just kind of wondering how this Pierre-Luc Dubois trade will pan out. It's a massive bet that they took on this player. They gave up, if you don't remember, they gave up Alex Iafallo, Gabe Vilardi, Rasmus Kupari, and a second round pick that belongs to the Montreal Canadiens. So that could be a pretty valuable piece of draft capital there. Last season, Iafallo had 14 goals and 36 points in 59 games. Velarde had 23 goals and 41 points in 63 games. And Rasmus Kupari is a former first round pick who I've likened to David Kampf in the past. I think that's a pretty reasonable comparison. Obviously, you'd hope his ceiling's maybe a bit higher, but the point being, he's a defensive minded center who will probably play in the bottom six of your lineup long term. As for Pierre Luc Dubois, he had 27 goals and 63 points in 73 games. So if you're looking at it strictly from the perspective of points, they definitely lost points in this deal, but they definitely gained depth down the center. So it'll be very interesting to see how kind of the trade off of depth on the wings for depth at center will play out for this team.
There's been kind of some rumblings about attitude issues with Dubois. I mean, he's requested out of two different teams now. There's been some clips of some abysmal shifts that he's had. I remember that one particularly with Columbus. But I feel like since he signed an 8-year deal with a team that he wants to play for, uh, those attitude issues kind of get tossed out the window. Like he wants to be here now. This is where he wants to play, so he can really just focus on hockey now. And I think there's something to be said about building your team through the middle. I think that's what all good championship teams have is they will be strong down the middle. So the 1, 2, 3 punch of Kopitar, Dubois, and then Deneau is really quite envious of the amount of teams that for their center depth. So I think it's a good trade.
Yeah, and I think a common saying that is probably around the NHL, more of a cliche, but I do actually agree with, is the team who gets the best player wins the trade. This is common in trades like the Matthew Tkachuk trade and the Tyler Seguin trade many years ago. I think that this is a little bit different with Dubois' ceiling being a little lower than those two players personally, but the same echo in that sentiment being that the LA Kings got the best player in the deal. They gave up players who will not be on their top line or competing with their top six next year tremendously. Gabe Vilardi's a great piece for the Winnipeg Jets to facilitate that trade, and that second round pick being Montreal's pick, so that could be very early in the second round, does help that trade go through. But at the same time, you got Pierre-Luc Dubois now as your second line center, which is a luxury now at this point, and this is amazing for the Los Angeles Kings to go forth with those three centers, as Noel mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other component of this too is kind of hoping that this is a guy that, as Anze Kopitar ages out, maybe this is a guy that can transition into either that number one role or continue to hold that number two role behind a guy like Quinton Byfield if he's able to work out as you'd hope he would on paper. So I think short term and long term, this was a pretty good trade. And in terms of what they gave up, it's a lot, but it makes sense. It's fairly reasonable, and they got a really long-term commitment from this player. So I think it's a good move. And yeah, so we'll have to see how it works out, but definitely building through the center.
Do you guys think his contract is fair for what his value is?
I definitely think it's reasonable. I think it's very comparable to the contract that Bo Horvat signed, if not identical. Was Bo Horvat almost
I think,
exactly 8 years at 8.5?
yeah, I think so.
I think it's identical. And to be honest, between those two players, I think there's a pretty good case to be made that you'd rather have Pierre-Luc Dubois. So in terms of comparables, I think it's a very fair contract.
Yeah, 8.5 million for his prime, or what you could call his prime, is a both a risk and a reward at the start. I think of all the Ottawa guys that got signed at their young
Yeah.
ages for $8 million, comparing to this, where you have to kind of overpay for someone's prime usually. But I am worried about the latter half of the contract because I consider someone's prime to be typically between 25 to 28, and these guys are already getting to the end of that age. So I think that Pierre-Luc Dubois might plateau at a certain point and then gradually decline in the latter half of the contract. We'll have to see how that goes, though. I hope the best for him.
Yeah, to me, normally with these long-term contracts, as long as you're not pushing up past around the age of 34, I think normally that's okay. And this contract will take him until I believe he's 33. So that works out perfectly fine for me. And if you think about the considerations of how much the cap should be going up by that time, an $8.5 million cap hit for a 32, 33-year-old Pierre-Luc Dubois, at that point, it might be a drop in the bucket. So who really knows? We can't really project that, but at the same time, I think to get him 8 years, an 8 year commitment and not have it take him above 34, 35 years old, I think that's a really safe bet, in my opinion, as long as health permits. And this guy who's been pretty healthy throughout his career to this point.
Yeah, and to be clear, a 25-year-old Pierre-Luc Dubois is quite different from a 28-year-old Bo Horvat in this situation.
Yeah,
Pierre-Luc Dubois is much
exactly.
more valuable and much more impactful for a team.
Exactly. So exact same contract and a player you'd rather have at that contract. So good piece of business in terms of the trade and the contract here for Rob Blake. Moving on to the final segment here for the Los Angeles Kings, just kind of an overview of their offseason and the upcoming season. For the offseason grade, it's going to be a B. They manage their business pretty well. It would be higher if they addressed the goaltending concerns. So they brought in Cam Talbot. To me, that's just really not enough. I like Phoenix Copley, but he'd be better as a 1B than a 1A. And I think that's kind of the role he's going to be thrust in to start this season. So if they had addressed goaltending, that'd be a bit higher, but unfortunately, going to be a B for now. In terms of offensive strength, it's going to be a B plus. I think this team has an incredibly deep top nine and a solid fourth line, so no concerns there. In terms of defensive strength, it's going to be a B. I think there are some questions on the defensive side for this team, namely guys like Brant Clark. We don't really know what he's going to be yet. So going to have to see how that works out. But overall, all right defense. So going to be there. And then as we've talked about with the goaltending already, Talbot and Copley are serviceable. So that's going to be a B minus. So definitely the weakest part of this team, but serviceable enough to definitely get them into the playoffs and maybe make a bit of noise if they're able to upgrade that later on. So in terms of future outlook, going to be a B. This is a team that has some aging players, but also some good young players. So kind of right down the middle there.
And looking at the projected Western Conference standings, we have the Kings pretty easily making the playoffs. We have them third in the Pacific. And this team has been eliminated in the first round at the hands of the Edmonton Oilers 2 years in a row now. So we're wondering if they will match up with them again this playoffs and if it will result in another first round exit or if they get a different opponent and that'll spark something in this team and they'll be able to go on a deeper run. Maybe just getting over that hump similar to the Leafs versus Lightning in recent years. But we have them third in the Pacific and looking for a good season from them.
Moving on to our final graphic here, just going over the individual rankings we each had for them. So Nick had them at 13th, making the playoffs. Noel had them at 10th, making the playoffs. And I had them at 9th, making the playoffs. So that's going to be an aggregate standing of 10th overall in the NHL, with a playoff spot pretty handily for this Los Angeles Kings team. Pretty similar here. I think maybe the reason I might be a bit higher on them than the other guys is I do have a decent bit of trust in Phoenix Copley. I like what I saw from him last year, so looking for him to have somewhat of a breakout year as that 1A tender for the Los Angeles Kings. But that is going to do it for today's video. So thank you guys so much for watching. We really appreciate all the support you guys have shown us so far. Please make sure to tune back in for the next one. It'll be out the next day. So thank you so much, guys, for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.